So we're looking at the lymphatic system. So let's just talk a little bit about what the lymphatic system is first. So this is a picture of the lymphatic system, and basically what it is another circulatory system. So remember we had the arteries and we had the veins and all that. That was a circulatory system for blood. Well, this is a circulatory system for a fluid called lymph. And so we're going to see how we create lymph and what lymph is and then what happens to it. But basically it's a one-way circulation. So it only goes in this direction. So it only goes from the outside to here, and then it goes back in the blood. Same thing over here, same thing in other places. So it's a one-way circulation from the tissues back to the blood. And so and it also has no heart. There's no pumping organ. And so we're going to see that as well. And so the vessels are going to be very similar to veins in how the fluid moves because there's no pumping organ. But let's look at it. So these are the different parts of the lymphatic system, and we're going to cover all of these different parts. And so we're going to see some structures in the head, around the mouth and the eyes. Those are the tonsils. We're going to see lymph nodes, which are scattered around in different parts of the body. We'll see lymph nodes. And then we'll look at some organs like the thymus and the spleen. And then we'll look at some structures that are associated with production of the white blood cells, like the bone marrow and the thymus I already mentioned. But anyway, let's look at these. So you can divide the lymphatic system basically up into three parts. So one of it is the fluid. It's lymph. But what lymph is tissue fluid. So if we go back and look at all of those tissues out here, the tissues in the arms, the tissues in the legs, the tissues in the abdomen and the chest and so on, that fluid is going to move and it's going to be emptied into the circulatory system. So lymph is just tissue fluid. We don't call it tissue fluid once it's inside the lymphatic system, though. We call it lymph. So that's one component of this lymphatic system. And then there are all the vessels that carry the lymph toward the circulatory system. And so these are going to be things like little capillaries and then bigger vessels and even bigger vessels. And so we're going to see all of these. These are all part of these lymphatic collecting vessels. And so they're going to collect this fluid and they're going to return it to the circulatory system. And then there's a third part, and this part are called lymphoid organs. So lymphoid organs are organs that have lots of white blood cells, tons of them. And what's going to happen is these white blood cells are going to check this fluid out as it passes by, and then what they're going to do with it is they're going to clean it, they're going to sterilize it, get anything out of it that's not supposed to be there before it gets back to the blood. And so when we look at these lymphoid organs, they can be divided up into three groups also. There are primary. Primary is where white blood cells are going to be born, basically, where they're going to develop, also where they're going to mature. And then there's secondary. Once they're mature, they're going to leave these primary organs and they're going to go somewhere where they're in contact with either the blood or the lymph. And they're going to, again, sterilize this blood, sterilize the lymph to make sure that there's nothing in it that's not supposed to be there. And then the last type is called MALT. MALT's an acronym. It stands for mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. We'll see that again in a little bit. But anyway, MALT is in the mucous membranes. So it's out where your body's in contact with the external environment. So the food that comes into your mouth, the air that goes into your nose, places like that, that's where we're going to find this MALT. So three different types or three different parts of this lymphatic system. So let's look at lymph first. So remember, lymph is fluid. Well, where does it come from? It actually comes from blood. So look, there's blood in here. This is a blood capillary. But as blood moves through here, it pushes against the wall of the capillary. And if you remember when we talked about capillaries, they're leaky. There are three different types of capillaries, but they're all leaky, so fluid leaks out. Now, the cells don't leak out because the holes are too small. Here's a cell or red blood cell. It's way too big, but fluid and all kinds of dissolved substances can leak out of these capillaries. And when it leaks out, it's going to leak out into the tissue spaces and become tissue fluid. It's a little bit like this. Here are all these capillaries. Look how many of them there are. Remember we said that if you add up all of the blood vessels in an average sized person, it's 66,000 miles of blood vessels. And most of these blood vessels are going to be capillaries. Well, look how many capillaries there are. Look just in one finger here. Just thousands and thousands and thousands of these tiny little capillaries. And remember, they're all leaky. So what happens is as fluid moves through these capillaries, the pressure causes fluid to leak out. And that fluid winds up in the tissues themselves. It becomes tissue fluid. Well, the more fluid that leaks out, the more tissue fluid there is. And it's going to fill up all the little spaces between the cells. All of these little tissue spaces are going to get full. Well, if we didn't have some way to recover this fluid, what would happen to the tissue is it would swell. So the tissue, as it filled up with fluid, would get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But there's this other circulatory system. In this picture, it's green. These are those little lymph vessels. And what's going to happen is the fluid is going to go into them. So if you look at these little lymphatic capillaries, look, they look like this. So here's our cells out here. Here's the tissue spaces with the fluid in it. That fluid pushes on these capillaries. And what happens is the little capillaries have little sort of trap doors. And the trap doors open and let the fluid come in. So that fluid, which was building up out here, and it's going to build up pressure, it's going to force its way into this capillary. And then the fluid is going to be removed. And so we're going to remove it from the tissues so that the tissues don't swell up. Well, as soon as the fluid gets inside a lymphatic vessel, it's not called tissue fluid anymore. It's called lymph. So that's what lymph is. All it is the liquid portion of blood that leaked out into the tissue spaces and then entered the lymphatic capillaries. Leaked out of the blood capillaries into the tissue spaces and then entered the lymphatic capillaries. That's all it is. Any questions about what lymph is? So lymph is made from blood. It's made from blood. And so it's similar to blood in a lot of ways. But it has no cells in it, no red blood cells. But it's got no red blood cells. It does have white blood cells and platelets in it, but no red blood cells. And it has few proteins. There's less protein than there is in the blood. But everything else that's in blood is in here. So it's got a lot of water. It's got a lot of ions. It's got a lot of nutrients and waste products. It's got a lot of gases in it. It's almost identical to blood plasma, except it has less protein. So, where's it going to go? Well, it first enters these vessels, and then it's going to go into bigger and bigger vessels until it gets emptied back into the circulatory system. So the first vessels are capillaries. So if we look at these capillaries, these are the very smallest vessels, and they're the first vessels. So here's this blood capillary fluids leaking out. Pressure's going to build up in the tissue, and now fluid's going to come into these lymphatic capillaries. Well, you can't see this model, but if we were on campus, we would see this. This is a model that shows these capillaries. So if you look at the red and the blue here, that's the blood capillary. So remember, blood capillaries look like this. They're just tons of these little capillaries. And so the fluid is going to leak out into these spaces here. And then here, the green one is our lymphatic capillary. And so that fluid is going to enter the lymphatic capillary, and then it's going to go this way. And the capillaries are going to merge and become bigger vessels. They're going to become collecting vessels. So if we look at that lymphatic capillary, there it is. There's the blood capillary right here next to it. There's the lymphatic capillary. Fluid's going to go this way. And when it gets in here, these become those lymphatic collecting vessels. So if you look at lymphatic collecting vessels, this is what they look like. They look a whole lot like veins. In fact, they're almost identical to veins. They have 3 layers, just like veins do. They have valves, just like veins do. They're very, very similar to veins, but the walls are even thinner than they are in veins. So the walls are extremely thin. Even though there's 3 layers, they're extremely thin. And then here's what those collecting vessels look like. And so look, they're going only in one direction. The fluid only goes in one direction. Well, here's another model that we would see if we were on campus. And all of these little white streaky lines are those lymphatic collecting vessels. And so the capillaries are out here. Capillaries are microscopic. The capillaries are here, and they're microscopic. And they're here. They're everywhere that blood capillaries are. And the fluid then is going to enter here, and it's going to begin to move this way. And again, it's going to keep moving only in one direction, and it's moving toward here and here. It's moving toward this, which is the junction of the subclavian vein and the internal jugular. And that's where it's going to empty back into the circulatory system. And there's one of these on each side, and we're going to see it empties, one on each side right there. So here's what a lymphatic collecting vessel looks like. So really thin walls. And then here are these valves. So if we look at the fluid can flow this way, but if the fluid tries to go backwards, it's going to catch on the edges of the valve here, and the valve is going to close. So fluid can only go in one direction, just like it does in veins. There's the real valve right there. So fluid can flow this way, but it cannot flow backwards. Well, those lymphatic collecting vessels are going to merge, and they're going to form even bigger vessels, which are called trunks. And there are 9 trunks. Most of them are in pairs. and they're named for where they're located. So look, jugular. It's right next to the jugular veins. It's in the neck. And what it's going to do is it's going to drain the head. Subclavian, right next to the subclavian veins, right below the clavicles. And what it's going to do is it's going to drain the arms and shoulders. And then if you look at bronchomediastinal, broncho refers to lungs. So this part's going to be draining the lungs, and mediastinal refers to the center of the chest. So it's going to drain the lungs and the chest. And then lumbar, if you look at that, that means the lower back. This is where the legs join on. And so this is going to drain the legs. And then finally, there's a one, not paired, but just one intestinal, which is going to drain the intestines. So if we look at that on a picture, we could see these trunks. Now they're not huge, so don't go looking for some huge things because they're not. But here are the trunks. So that's a jugular trunk, and that's a jugular trunk. That's a subclavian trunk, and that's a subclavian trunk. That's a bronchomediastinal trunk, and that's a bronchomediastinal trunk. There's a lumbar. There's the other lumbar. And then remember, we only have just one intestinal trunk. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 trunks. Does that make sense to everyone? So if we look on our model, here are the trunks. Look again, they're not big things. But there's our vessels. Remember, the fluid's moving this way. They're going to merge together and get bigger and bigger vessels until we get these trunks. And so here are the trunks that we can see right here. So there's a subclavian trunk, there's a subclavian trunk, there's a jugular trunk, and so on. If we come down a little further, we can see them a little better. So the way the model's built, this is covered up over here. So we really only see one example of each trunk. So we're going to see one of each, one subclavian, one jugular, one bronchomediastinal. But remember, they're in pairs. Don't forget. But there's the trunk. It's not big. It's just this section right here. That's the trunk. And there's the trunk right there. It's not big. And there's the trunk right there. Now this one goes a little further up, a little longer, but it's still not very big. And we come down, here is these down here. Remember, lumbar and intestinal. Well, it's hard to see on this model, but there they are down here. So there's the lumbar, there's the intestinal. Right, there's a lumbar one. Now, if this were out of the way, we'd be able to see it better. On some models, this is actually removable and you can see underneath it, but this one's not. But if you go back and look at this right here, look, the lumbars and the intestinal, they join together right here. And it looks almost like a balloon where they join together. That is called the cisterna chyli. Now, it's not chili, it's chyli. Look, there's a cisterna chyli right there. There it is again right there. It's like a balloon, sort of. And it's where these three join together, the two lumbars and the intestinal. Any questions about the trunks? So how many trunks are there? 9, exactly. They're all in pairs except for the intestinal one. That's the only one that's not paired. Well, those trunks are going to merge and form even bigger vessels. And these vessels are called ducts. And there are only 2 of these ducts. One of them's on the right side and one of them's on the left side. So you could call them the right lymphatic duct and the left lymphatic duct. But usually the left one is called the thoracic. And so we say right lymphatic and thoracic. Well, the right lymphatic is a little short thing right there. And it's what empties into this subclavian vein and the jugular vein, right where they come together. That's where it empties. But the thoracic one doesn't start there. It starts here. Remember, that's our balloon-like structure, that cisterna chyli. The thoracic duct starts there and goes all the way up. And then it empties. So the thoracic duct is quite long, whereas the right lymphatic duct is quite short. But again, it's going to empty into the junction between the jugular vein and the subclavian vein, but on the left side. So if we look on our model, it looks like this. There, right there, is the right lymphatic duct. But here, starts at the cisterna chyli and goes all the way. That's the thoracic duct. Well, if we blow that up a little more, it looks like this. So here is the right lymphatic duct. It only goes from there to there. And then here's our cisterna chyli. So the thoracic duct is this whole long thing, all the way from the cisterna chyli up to the junction of these 2 veins. So there's the cisterna chyli, there's the thoracic duct. You can see it going up, keeps going all the way up. There it is again, right there, and there's our right one. So again, just this little section here, but this whole big section here. Any questions about either of these? Well, look, they're nowhere near the same size. They're nowhere near the same size, and they don't drain the same amount of your body. This one's tiny. This one's huge. And so this one's going to drain a much bigger portion of your body than the other one is. And so if we look at where it drains, it looks like this. So this is where the body is drained by the thoracic duct. This is the right lymphatic duct. So the right lymphatic duct only drains the right side of the head, the right side of the neck, the right side of the chest, and the right arm. That's it. Whereas if you look at the thoracic duct, look, it drains the left side of the head, neck, left side of the chest, left arm, but then the entire lower part of your body, the abdomen and both legs. And so it drains a much, much bigger part of the body than the right one does. Does it make sense to everyone? So remember, if we think about our trunks, here is the jugular, and here is the subclavian, and here is the right mediastinal. That's what's going to go into the right lymphatic duct. But if we think about what goes into the thoracic, it's this jugular over here, the subclavian over here, the bronchomediastinal over here. Then remember, we've got this cisterna, chyli, and then there's the one from that leg, the lumbar, the one from that leg, the lumbar, and then the one from the intestine. That's what's going to go into the thoracic duct. Any questions? Okay, so those are the lymphatic collecting vessels. Let's look at lymphatic organs. So remember, lymphatic organs are where we have a whole lot of white blood cells, a ton of white blood cells. It's also where these white blood cells are developed and where they mature. And so different lymphoid organs are sort of going to have different jobs. And here you can see them, they're scattered around. So lymphoid organs include things like tonsils and lymph nodes and the thymus and the spleen, the appendix, which we hear about not having a function. That's not true. And then these other things as well. Remember, we can divide lymphoid organs up into three groups. There's primary, there's secondary, and there's MALT. So primary, remember, primary is where we produce white blood cells. We produce them. That's where they're born. It also is where they mature. They sort of go to school. Well, there are two primary lymphoid organs. One is the red bone marrow, and one is the thymus. So we'll look at both of those. Once they mature, they leave these places and they go to the secondary, or they go to the MALT. What happens in the secondary is that they destroy pathogens in our body fluids, in our blood, and in our lymph. And the ones that do that are the spleen and the lymph nodes. And so we'll look at those. And then some of these, when they leave, they go to outposts, sort of. They go to mucosa. So remember, we have these mucosae that face the external environment. So we have a nasal mucosa, oral mucosa, intestinal mucosa, all of that. And so what happens is there are little patches of this tissue that face the external environment. And what they do is they try to prevent bacteria and viruses and so on from entering the body. So they keep it out. So let's look at the lymphoid organs. Let's look at the primary ones first. Remember, there are two of these. There's the red bone marrow and the thymus. Those are the two primary lymphoid organs. So let's look at the thymus first. So the thymus is kind of a strange little organ. First of all, it's located in the mediastinum. So it's in the middle part of the chest. What makes it kind of weird is, as you get older, it shrinks. So when you're a baby, it's pretty small, and it grows just like a baby does. But when you hit about age 14 or 15, that's as big as it's going to get. And after that, what happens is it begins to atrophy. It begins to shrink. And by the time you're in your 40s, late 40s, early 50s, you can't even find it anymore. But it's large in children, very large. And what it does is it trains the white blood cells of the immune system. And the white blood cells that come here, they mature, and when they leave, they're called T cells. The T stands for thymus. And so it's going to train T cells. There's no contact with pathogens here. So these cells do not interact with pathogens in the thymus. It's just sort of like a school. It's not until they leave that they actually do anything associated with keeping us healthy. Here's what the thymus looks like under a microscope. You see it's got a bunch of little lobules. You can even see these lobules on here. There's a lobule and a lobule. Well, look at it. Every little purple dot that you see is the nucleus of a white blood cell. So look how many white blood cells are in this just one picture. There's no way to count them. There are hundreds of thousands just in this one picture. And so there are millions and millions inside the thymus. So remember, they're going to come here, they're going to be trained, and then they're going to leave. And they're going to leave as competent T cells. Again, our immune system is developing when we're a child. And so the thymus in a child is very, very large. But look what happens when you get to be an adult. Look how much it shrunk. It atrophies right around puberty, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Supposedly, our immune system is fully developed, and we don't need the school anymore. And so we sort of shut the training center down. The other primary lymphoid organ is the red bone marrow. So if you look inside bones, remember they're hollow in the shaft, but if you look at the ends, these tiny little spaces, we have spongy bone. And inside the spongy bone is where the red bone marrow is. Well, red bone marrow is responsible for making all blood cells. So red blood cells are made here. All the white blood cells are made here. And that's also where the platelets are made. And so it looks like this. If you look in there, you can see the spongy bone, and it's red because of the red blood cells. But it also makes white blood cells. And some of those white blood cells stay here and mature, and so they train here. And once they train, they leave. And when they leave, they're called B cells. The B stands for bone marrow. And then the B cells are going to go out and they're going to do the things they're supposed to do. But again, there are no pathogens here. So there's no interaction with pathogens in the bone marrow. It's not until they get out somewhere until they interact with pathogens. Now, as you get older, red bone marrow amount also decreases, just like the thymus. And it gets replaced with yellow bone marrow, which is just fat. So if you look in there, you can see glob of fat right there. That does not make cells. It just stores energy. If we look at it under a microscope, there's the bone. This is spongy bone. So we have these trabeculae. And then look at this. All of these are those white blood cells. Just tons and tons and tons of them. So that's the primary lymphoid organs. Remember, primary is all about developing and maturing white blood cells. And then they're going to leave, and some of them are going to go to the secondary lymphoid organs. So remember, secondary lymphoid organs are the ones in contact with our body fluids. So they're in contact with our blood, or they're in contact with our lymph. And their job is to make sure there's nothing in the blood or the lymph that's not supposed to be there. So the secondary lymphoid organs are the lymph nodes and the spleen. So let's look at these. Let's look at lymph nodes first. So lymph nodes are very small little organs, and they're located associated with the lymphatic collecting vessel. So here's a lymphatic collecting vessel, and the fluid is flowing through here. Well, every so often the fluid flows through a node. So a node is a little organ that the fluid is going to pass through. And when that goes through that node, we're going to clean it. We're going to get rid of anything that's not supposed to be there. We're going to sterilize it. And so there are multiple lymph nodes that this fluid is going to flow through. So if you look at lymph nodes, that's what these little yellow dots are. And so look, the fluid coming from this way has got to pass through a bunch of lymph nodes before it goes back into the blood. The fluid coming this way has to pass through a bunch of lymph nodes before it goes back into the blood. Well, lymph nodes are just named for their location. So we don't have a lot of lymph nodes in our arms and in our legs. They're very few. The lymph nodes are clustered right around the trunk. So there are tons of them in the armpits. There's tons of them in the neck. There's tons of them in the groin. And so they're named for those places. So we have cervical lymph nodes. We have axillary. We have inguinal, intestinal, and bronchomediastinal. And so if we look here, you can see there are very few lymph nodes out here. Now look, there's a few at the elbow, same thing with the knee. But most of them are here in the armpit, or they're here in the neck, or they're in here in the groin. And you can actually feel these lymph nodes if you know what you're looking for. And so if you ever go to the doctor and you're sick, one of the things they do is they feel these lymph nodes to see if they're swollen. So they palpate your lymph nodes. They feel your neck, they feel under your arms. Because what happens is if you get an infection, those lymph nodes will swell up. And so the doctor can feel swollen lymph nodes. So if you look at a swollen lymph node, it would be something like, somewhere. It would be like this. So there's a swollen lymph node. And what happens is when it swells, it closes off the exits. So the fluid gets trapped in here. Not only does the fluid get trapped, but so does the pathogens, trapped in here with all of those white blood cells that are located here. And so when you have a swollen lymph node, it's a really, really good indication that there's something in there that's not supposed to be there. Now, hopefully we're going to get rid of that. And then what's going to happen is the fluid will drain back out and the lymph node will go back to its normal size again. But let's look at what the lymph nodes look like. So remember, they're named just for their location. They really aren't any different depending on where you are. They're pretty much all exactly the same. So look at a single lymph node. It looks something like this. They're bean-shaped. They're shaped like a bean. And look, they have an indented area right here, like a bean does. And that indented area is called the hilus or hilum. If you look here, there are vessels that are bringing lymph to the lymph node. So remember, these are lymphatic collecting vessels. You can even see the valves in here. The fluid can only flow in one direction. If it's going toward the lymph node, they're called afferent lymphatic vessels. There are also vessels, though, that drain the lymph node, so the fluid's going out. Those are efferent lymphatic vessels. But if you notice, there are more afferents than there are efferents. What that means is that the fluid is going to slow down when it gets in here because it comes in faster than it can go out. And so it's going to stagnate in here. Well, that's a good thing because this is where all of those white blood cells are. So if you look again over here, every little black dot you see is the nucleus of a white blood cell. So that fluid is going to come in and it's going to trickle around like this. It's going to pass by all of those white blood cells until finally it leaves. It's going to come in, trickle, meander, all that until finally it's going to leave. And as it does so, what's going to happen is these white blood cells are going to check it out. They're going to check it for things that are not supposed to be there, like pathogens. If there are any pathogens, what's going to happen is those white blood cells are going to release chemicals, and the chemicals are going to cause these vessels to close. So now fluid's still coming in, but it can't get back out. And so what's going to happen is the lymph node is going to swell up. But as soon as we get rid of that infection, we're going to stop causing these vessels to close. We're going to stop releasing those chemicals. And so the vessels are going to open up, the fluid is going to leave, and the lymph node is going to go back down to its normal size. Well, again, here's another picture of a lymph node, and every little dot that you see is the nucleus of a white blood cell. So there's the fluid coming in, and then here's the fluid going out, and look, it's going to meander around all over these, past these white blood cells. Well, if you look at a lymph node, it has some different regions to it. So it has, first of all, a wall. That is just called the capsule. The capsule. But the capsule isn't just on the outside. It folds in like this, and it forms these sort of walls. The walls are called trabeculae. And so we're going to wind up with little compartments. So here's a compartment or a lobule. And then here's another one, and so on. And then if you look inside the compartments, what you're going to see are white blood cells, tons of them. Well, they're actually arranged in two different sort of shapes, if you will. There's a center thing here, which is called a follicle. So there's the follicle, there's another follicle, there's another one. And then there are cells around that are not part of the follicle, and they're different kinds of cells. I'm not going to ask you to remember what types of cells they are, but look, you can see follicles here. These are the follicles. In the darker area are lymphocytes. They're mostly B cells. B cells. Remember, B cells come from the bone marrow. But in the center here are mostly macrophages, which, remember, are activated monocytes. And so that's exactly what we see here. There's two layers to the lymph node. There's a layer that's the outside layer. It's this layer here. And this layer is called the cortex. And then there's this layer, which is in the center here, which has mostly got blood vessels and these lymphatics in it. That's called the medulla. And then, of course, we have this capsule and these trabeculae. So here's what happens. The fluid enters by way of an afferent vessel. It goes into these hollow spaces. It's going to trickle around. It's going to meander. It's going to go bypass those white blood cells. And so the white blood cells, the lymphocytes and the macrophages are going to have time to carry out the things they're supposed to do. And then hopefully the fluid, when it leaves, it's going to be clean. It's going to be sterile. There are not going to be any pathogens in it. And so if we look at these lymph nodes, you can just see how many of them there are. And we kind of already talked about this, but what happens if you have an infection? Well, the pathogen is going to wind up in a lymph node, and what happens? The white blood cells are going to release those chemical messengers, and we're going to close off the efferent vessels. So fluid keeps coming in, but it can't get out, so the lymph node swells up until the infection is gotten rid of. Once it's cleared, the efferent vessels are going to open and the lymph's going to leave. Any questions about lymph nodes? Okay, let's talk about the spleen. So the spleen is a little bit like a giant lymph node. Now it's not, don't make the assumption, but it looks a little bit like one. And it has sort of the same job that the lymph node does. Remember, the lymph node, its job was to clean the lymph. Well, the spleen, its job is to clean the blood. Well, when you get inside the spleen, blood gets separated into two different spaces in here. If you look at it, it looks very much like a lymph node. It has a capsule, it has trabeculae, all of that's very similar. But when you get in here, it looks different. It doesn't look like the lymph node. And actually, the spleen has two jobs, and it's got two spaces for those jobs to happen. One of those jobs is to remove old and damaged red blood cells. So it's going to remove the old red blood cells. Remember, they only last about 120 days. And then we're going to get rid of them. Most of the time that happens in here. And so when you look in here, you'll see spaces that are very red. But it also has another job, and that is to clean the plasma, clean the blood. And when you look in the areas where that happens, it's not so red. It's more pale. Now, these are stained. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to see it. But there are two different areas. They're called pulps. So we have this pulp. Look at it. It's red. That's where the red blood cells are being removed. But then this is not red. Now, in the picture it's purple, but remember that stain. This is called white pulp. So white pulp is where the plasma is being cleaned. And look at these little purple dots. Every one of those purple dots is a white blood cell. And so these white blood cells are going to monitor the plasma for things that are not supposed to be there. Now this picture is labeled for you, but look, this has got red in it. Red, but there's hardly any red in there. So red pulp, again, is where we get rid of old or damaged red blood cells. And white pulp, again, is where we monitor and clean and sterilize the plasma. Now remember, this is our lymph node, and it looks very, very similar. Look, tons and tons of white cells. And just like we had the fluid that moved through the lymph node, we have the same thing that happens with the spleen. The fluid moves through here. And again, we're going to clean it up and get rid of anything that's not supposed to be there. So those are the secondary lymphoid tissues. And then the last thing we have is MALT. And again, that's just an acronym, and this is what it stands for, mucosa. So remember, the mucosae are those membranes that line the cavities that open to the outside. So if you think about your nose, there's an opening to the outside where air comes in. Well, this membrane that it goes across is a mucosa. If you think about your mouth, so food and liquid and air go in there. There's a membrane that lines the mouth, and that's a mucosa. Same thing for the esophagus, same thing for the stomach, same thing for the intestines, and so on. So where we have these mucosae, some areas we have little nodules, almost like nodes. They're the same thing as the lymph nodes. They're mucosa associated, and then they have lots of white blood cells, lymphoid tissues. And the MALT are things like tonsils. So here are the tonsils. They're around the mouth and the nose. Down here are tonsils too. We don't call them that, but they're just like tonsils, but they're called Peyer's patches. And then right here is the appendix, which is also just like this other material. They're all high concentrations of white blood cells. Well, if you look at the tonsils, there are 3 pairs of tonsils, and they make sort of a circle around the mouth and the nose. Look, it's sort of a circle. So there's a pair that are up here in the nasal cavity, or the nasopharynx. These are called pharyngeal tonsils. Sometimes they're called adenoids. And then there's 2 pair in the mouth. There's a pair that are on the base of the tongue. They're called lingual. And in order to see them, you have to push the tongue down because they're on the base of the tongue. And then there are 2 that are on the soft palate. So they're called palatine. But think about it. Food, liquid, air, it has to pass by these things in order to go where it's going. And as that food, liquid, and air passes by, it is not sterile. It's got lots of nasty stuff that comes in with it. And so the tonsils then are there like first responders, if you want to think of them that way. And so they're the first ones to come into contact with anything that's bad. And so their job is to clean it up. So again, there are 3 pairs of tonsils. This one is up in the nasopharynx. There's the one on the soft palate, and there's the tongue and the one that's on the base of the tongue. So if you look inside someone's mouth, you can actually see these tonsils. So there's the palatine tonsils. They're easy to see, but you need a tongue depressor to push down the tongue to be able to see that one. And then over here, these hang down like this, very little tiny bit. So if you tilt your head backwards, you can see them. And so again, there's the tonsils. If we look at them under a microscope, they look like this. So look, again, every purple spot that you see is a white blood cell. And so those white blood cells are there, and the food that comes by, the liquid that comes by, the air that comes by is going to come into contact with these white blood cells. We also have tonsils down in our intestines, but we call them Peyer's patches. So look, if we were to take a chunk out of the intestines, that's what this is. So here's a chunk out of the wall of the intestine. Over here's where the food is, but it's also where bacteria and stuff are. Well, if you look right here, there's Peyer's patch. It's an intestinal tonsil, if you will. Now you can also see the lymphatic collecting vessels and lymphatic collecting or capillaries, but this is our Peyer's patch. And so the food then has to pass by this. And there's not one Peyer's patch, there's hundreds and hundreds of them. There's the Peyer's patch. Here's where the food and the bacteria and stuff is. And it has to pass by. So if you look at that under a microscope, every single one of these is a Peyer's patch. So here's where the food is out here. And so the food has to pass by. You can see just how many of these things there are. And if you look, every single little purple dot is going to be a white blood cell. See, much easier over here, but every single little purple dot is a white blood cell. And then we have the appendix. Most people, when they hear about the appendix, they only hear about it when there's something wrong with it. And so a lot of people get the wrong impression that it's not useful, that it's sort of a leftover. In fact, Charles Darwin said it was vestigial, which is sort of a leftover, no more function. But that's not true at all. It's the exact same function as the tonsils, as the Peyer's patches. And so there's tons of bacteria in here. And so the job of this, there's tons of white blood cells here, is to keep that from getting into your body. So if you look at it, there it is right there. It looks a little bit like a worm. So a lot of times it's called vermiform, which means worm-shaped. The vermiform appendix. Appendix is something that's at the end of a book. It's kind of a leftover, and that is not what it really is. But that's why it's named. But look at it. Again, every single little dot is a white blood cell. So think about all the food, the bacteria are here. You've got tons of white blood cells to fight those bacteria and keep them from invading the body. So don't let anyone tell you that the appendix has no use. That's not true. You should be able to explain to them that it's the same as the tonsils. And don't let anyone tell you the tonsils are not valuable. They are. Same thing with the Peyer's patches, which are here. So if you have to have one of these things removed, so you have to have your tonsils removed or you have to have the appendix removed, that's going to lower your ability to fight off bacteria. And so someone who's had a tonsillectomy or an appendectomy, they have a lowered ability to fight off pathogens. They have a decreased immune system. Any questions? So that's the lymphatic system. So Deli says, what causes the appendix or tonsils to have to be removed? Well, the job of these, remember, is to fight off bacteria. But sometimes they can become infected on their own. And if they become infected and even though there's tons of white blood cells in here, the white blood cells are unable to fight off this infection. One of the things that happens when something gets infected is it swells up. Remember, we get inflammation. And so if it swells up, think about where it is. They're here where you breathe. They're here where you swallow. And if it swells and it swells long enough, it can close off those tubes. So if you close off your ability to breathe, you're not going to be able to live. If you close off the food and all that, you're not going to be able to eat. And if that swelling doesn't decrease on its own, sometimes they have to remove it to prevent you from having issues like that. Same thing can happen here. Again, it can get infected. There are tons of bacteria here, and sometimes those white blood cells are not able to fight it off. And so this thing swells up too, and it causes abdominal pain and so on. And it could swell to the point where it ruptures. Well, if it ruptures, that means that the intestinal contents, the stuff that's in here, which has got thousands and thousands and thousands of bacteria, they have a hole to go out, and they go into your body cavity. They go into the peritoneum. And so you can have the infection that encompasses basically the whole body cavity. And so you can die from it. And so they're removed as a last resort. Used to, it was a lot more common than it is now, but now it's a lot less common. They try very hard to let you keep these. Same thing here. It's done as a last resort. Is it a matter of genetics or lifestyle that causes it to be so infected as to require removal? You know, I don't know of a study that's shown any kind of link with either of those. There are just some babies that are born, and as they grow up, they have just infection after infection after infection. They just constantly have tonsillitis. And so instead of being able to get rid of it, they're just not able to do it. I can look it up or whatever if you want me to, but I don't know of any connection that has anything to do with genetics or lifestyle. Some people just have a stronger immune system. Some people have a weaker immune system. Any other questions? Okay, so that's the end of the lymphatic system, and we're going to stop there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.